What if the stories we inherited are only the fractured remnants of something far older, carved from memories the world was never meant to keep? What if the past we cling to, chronologies, scriptures, tidy sequences of empires rising and falling, was merely the surface layer of a narrative that once stretched far beyond the reach of any sanctioned history? For centuries, apocryphal writings were dismissed as theological footnotes, curiosities for scholars and mystics. But when read carefully, line by line, they whisper of eras that do not fit into any official timeline, of catastrophic cycles, vanished civilizations, and intermediaries who once walked between realms. These forbidden texts do not shout their secrets. They murmur them, as though fearful of being heard by the very forces that buried them. And when their fragments are assembled, even imperfectly, they reveal a portrait of humanity that is both unsettling and strangely inevitable, one in which revelation was not a singular event, but a recurring rupture, echoing across ages long forgotten. The deeper you look, the more the familiar contours of history begin to bend, twist, and finally collapse into something unrecognizable. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. It begins with a silence that should not exist. A silence wedged between the lines of manuscripts that survived only because someone, somewhere, believed they were harmless. But nothing truly harmless is ever hidden this carefully. When you confront the apocryphal texts that orbit the periphery of accepted scripture, you feel that silence stirring, as though the pages themselves are inhaling before offering truths that were never meant to fit inside familiar historical scaffolding. The deeper you wander into them, the more you realize that what has been framed as marginal, speculative, or heretical may instead preserve the final echoes of something far older than any canonical doctrine could allow. And it is within that quiet, suspended moment between the sanctioned and the forbidden that the first crack appears, revealing the faint outline of a past that has always been there, waiting for someone to notice. Scholars often approach these writings as oddities, literary offshoots, or theological experiments created by communities struggling to articulate their identity. Yet when you strip away the interpretive layers that centuries have painted onto them, you discover recurrent patterns that refuse to be dismissed as coincidence. They speak of cycles, epochs that rise and collapse, and of figures that intervene not as gods in the classical sense, but as custodians of knowledge, bearers of warnings, or witnesses to transformations so immense that no surviving culture could fully comprehend them. There is a tone in these texts, a peculiar blend of dread and reverence, suggesting that the authors were attempting to describe events that felt both incomprehensible and intimately close, like memories carried not by individuals, but by entire civilizations. Consider one such fragment, attributed to an unnamed visionary whose words appear only through later quotations. He describes a radiance that descends in silence, a phrase that at first seems poetic until you realize it echoes accounts from entirely different regions and centuries, all referring to a moment when the world was altered by something not quite earthly. The descriptions differ in their metaphors but converge in their emotional gravity. an encounter with beings or forces that did not simply appear, but imposed a shift upon the landscape of understanding. Whether interpreted as divine intervention, cosmic intrusion, or ancestral return, the essence is the same. Something came from beyond the familiar horizon, leaving behind traces that later scribes struggled to encode. Those who preserved these accounts often wrote with a trembling restraint, as though fearful that too much detail would invite consequences from whatever source had once delivered the revelation. This is the threshold where unsettling questions emerge. Why do so many forbidden writings contain allusions to civilizations older than the ones recognized by archaeology? Why do they repeatedly reference structures or cities built before memory, or raised in the age before the first age? These phrases are not mere mythic embroidery. They are specific enough to suggest that their authors believed themselves connected to a lineage that extended far beyond the known boundaries of human chronology. It is as though they stood on the edge of a precipice, overlooking a timeline that stretched backward into a darkness lit only by whispers. Some texts describe epochs preceding the familiar biblical narrative, epochs in which humanity was guided or manipulated by towering figures who carried knowledge like a burden and moved across the early world as silent architects. One obscure text from the Near Eastern tradition depicts an age marked by luminous storms that swept across the land, storms so powerful that they warped the surface of the earth. The author, clearly shaken, speaks of pillars of fire that did not burn, and voices inside the light that instructed the survivors on how to rebuild. These accounts are woven into theological arguments, but the emotional core feels older than the doctrine surrounding it. It feels like a memory, or at least an attempt to preserve one. And while mainstream historians dismiss such descriptions as symbolic language meant to express divine intervention, the precision with which they are described, light without heat, pillars that move with intention, voices emerging from a radiance, creates an uncanny alignment with traditions separated by continents and millennia. Even more perplexing are the warnings embedded in these forbidden texts. They speak of cycles of destruction, of knowledge granted and withdrawn, of humanity rising to a threshold it was not prepared to cross. One apocryphal writer claims that the world has been reset 4 times, and that the current era is merely another attempt at stabilizing a story that continually unravels. He writes of watchers who observe from unseen vantage points, stepping in only when the imbalance becomes irrevocable. Yet he also hints that after each intervention, the memory of earlier epochs is deliberately obscured, not erased, but scattered into fragments that only the persistent or the desperate ever uncover. It is a chilling suggestion that humanity's amnesia is not natural, but curated. These forbidden writings often hint at tensions between the custodians of knowledge and the societies they influenced. Some portray these custodians as benevolent guides who bestowed agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and the mysteries of written language. Others describe them as stern adjudicators whose patience with human ambition was finite and whose judgment descended with catastrophic force. In one account, a scribe laments that his people looked upon the face of the radiant ones with pride instead of humility, and as a consequence, the land was swallowed by waters that arrived not from storms, but from the fountains beneath the earth. The phrase is peculiar, Yet it finds parallels in flood myths from multiple cultures, all of which describe deluges triggered not by rain alone, but by seismic ruptures that unleashed underground oceans. This overlap becomes even more striking when examined alongside archaeological anomalies, sites whose construction methods defy the capabilities attributed to ancient civilizations, or whose orientation aligns with celestial positions from eras much older than their accepted age. While conventional explanations insist these are coincidences or misinterpretations, the forbidden texts offer a different possibility. Perhaps these structures were not the work of a single culture at a single time, but were repaired, repurposed, or rebuilt across multiple forgotten cycles. Some texts even imply that humanity repeatedly inherits ruins without realizing their true age, believing their grandeur belongs solely to the most recent civilization that touched them. According to these writings, our historical memory begins not at the beginning, but somewhere in the middle of a much longer narrative. One of the most contested apocryphal passages describes a group of figures descending, wrapped in thunder, yet speaking softly, who revealed to early humans a system of measuring time based not on the sun and moon alone, but on celestial cycles so vast they spanned thousands of years. The text claims that these figures instructed their listeners to build observatories of stone, not for worship, but for survival. These structures, they said, would serve as anchors across ages, allowing future generations to identify when the next cycle of upheaval drew near. It is a haunting suggestion, and one that resonates with the uncanny astronomical precision found at ancient sites across the world. Structures that seem to track precessional cycles with an accuracy difficult to reconcile with the knowledge level of early societies. More disturbing still is the insistence, voiced in multiple forbidden texts, that knowledge was not merely granted, but negotiated. One writer describes an encounter in which the radiant beings offered humanity a choice: remain in a state of innocence or accept the burden of understanding. This is not the familiar narrative of temptation found in canonical scripture. It is presented instead as a solemn pact, an agreement that would bind humanity to a trajectory of innovation, conflict, and eventual reckoning. The writer reflects that humanity chose understanding not out of greed, but out of an instinctive desire to survive in a world already shaped by forces beyond its control. And yet he warns that this choice carried a price, one that would be paid not by the generation that made it, but by those who inherited the consequences. This sense of inherited destiny permeates the apocryphal literature. The writers repeatedly emphasize that humanity is part of an unfinished story, one whose earlier chapters have been lost or concealed. In some texts, this concealment is attributed to natural disasters that obliterated entire regions. In others, it is portrayed as a deliberate act carried out by those same custodians of knowledge who feared that too much understanding would provoke rebellion or destabilize the fragile equilibrium they sought to maintain. There is even a hint, in some writings, that certain revelations were withheld until humanity reached a level of maturity capable of bearing them without self-destruction. One forbidden text tells of a mountain that split open during an era before the first recorded year, revealing chambers carved with symbols that glowed faintly in darkness. The author admits he never saw the chambers himself. His account is based on testimonies passed down through generations. Yet the precision of his description, spiral motifs, geometric alignments, murals depicting figures gesturing toward the stars, bears an eerie resemblance to actual archaeological discoveries made in remote regions. Scholars dismiss these similarities as coincidence or retroactive interpretation, but the alignment raises an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the forbidden texts preserve distorted memories of real places that once existed and may still exist, buried beneath geological upheaval or the ruins of later civilizations. As you follow the threads woven through these writings, a broader picture begins to emerge. It is not a linear timeline, but a series of overlapping cycles, each marked by revelations, collapses, and rebirths. Some texts describe humanity as apprentices, learning from cosmic teachers. Others depict a species constantly struggling to reclaim knowledge it once possessed. The tone oscillates between awe and despair, suggesting that the authors were grappling with the sense that they were living within the remnants of something far greater, a civilization broken long before their time, leaving behind only shards of a story too vast to comprehend. This mosaic of fragments challenges every conventional assumption about how history unfolds. It suggests that humanity is not ascending from primitive origins toward complexity, but reassembling pieces of a lost inheritance. The apocryphal writers portray themselves not as inventors of new truths, but as custodians of fading memories, desperately recording what remains before it vanishes forever. They describe revelations that shimmer on the edge of consciousness, insights delivered in dreams, visions, or encounters that defy rational explanation. Some even imply that these revelations were triggered by contact with phenomena that modern readers might describe as otherworldly. Lights that descend without sound, figures who appear and disappear without leaving footprints, voices that speak in languages understood intuitively rather than intellectually. In one particularly unsettling passage, a scribe recounts a night when a radiant presence appeared at the edge of a desert settlement, its form obscured by shimmering air. The villagers watched in silence as the being traced symbols into the sand, symbols that glowed with an inner fire before sinking beneath the surface. The next morning the sand was smooth, unmarked, yet the villagers found themselves able to recall the symbols with perfect clarity, as though they had been etched into their minds rather than the earth. The scribe writes that this memory haunted them for generations, and that those who attempted to replicate the symbols claimed they revealed patterns in the stars that foretold coming upheavals. If these accounts are taken at face value, they imply interactions with forces far beyond the cultural and technological horizons of ancient societies. But even if one approaches them with skepticism, their consistency is difficult to ignore. Across continents and centuries, isolated communities describe encounters with luminous figures, warnings of cyclical destruction, and the transmission of knowledge designed to outlast the rise and fall of civilizations. It is as if the forbidden texts are fragments of a dispersed archive, each preserving a sliver of a truth that was once known collectively, but is now scattered across the world's cultural memory. The apocryphal authors understood that they were writing in the shadow of something immense. Their tone is not one of arrogance, but of humility tinged with fear. They describe revelations that arrived unbidden, visions that disrupted their understanding of the world, and hints of a cosmology in which humanity is neither central nor entirely autonomous. They depict a universe filled with watchers, messengers, and forces that intervene only when the balance tilts too far toward chaos. These descriptions challenge the notion of a purely human-driven history, implying instead that the trajectory of civilization has been shaped by interactions with entities or intelligence woven into the fabric of existence since time immemorial. And yet, despite the magnitude of what they describe, the forbidden texts remain at the margins, catalogued as curiosities, debated in academic footnotes, or dismissed outright. But when you gather them, when you lay their fragments side by side and trace the recurring patterns, something remarkable takes shape. You begin to perceive the outline of a story larger than any single culture, a story that spans epochs and suggests that humanity has lived through multiple cycles of revelation and erasure. You begin to sense that the past is not a distant country, but a palimpsest, a layered manuscript in which earlier narratives were scraped away, yet continue to bleed through the surface. In this realization lies both the wonder and the danger. For if the forbidden texts are even partially accurate, then our understanding of history is not merely incomplete, it is fundamentally misaligned. We are not the culmination of a long upward climb, but the survivors of repeated cataclysms, inheritors of knowledge that has been lost and regained countless times. And the revelations contained in these texts may not be warnings about the distant past, but omens for the near future. If the cycles described by the apocryphal authors hold true, then we may be approaching another turning point, another moment when the veil thins and the forces that once guided or judged humanity return to reclaim their role. There is a moment as you move deeper into the forbidden manuscripts when a strange clarity begins to settle over you, not the clarity of certainty, but the eerie recognition that different fragments written in distant lands appear to be describing the same thing. It is as if the authors stood on opposite sides of a great, ancient catastrophe and recorded their impressions without ever knowing others had done the same. You begin to sense an invisible architecture binding them together, not through shared culture or trade routes, but through a memory so old it seems to seep through the cracks of human consciousness itself. The apocryphal texts are not uniform. They vary wildly in style, tone, and purpose. Yet beneath the differences lies something consistent, as though they were all responding to the same unspoken influence, a presence felt but never fully understood. One of the most revealing threads comes from an obscure manuscript preserved only in fragments. Its author, whose identity has been lost, writes of a shadow that fell across the understanding of men, suggesting that knowledge was not merely lost through forgetfulness, but actively withdrawn. He speaks of a time when humanity walked with those who came before the first dawn, a cryptic phrase that has baffled scholars. The text recounts teachings delivered through symbols rather than spoken language, symbols so intricate that even the scribes who copied them admitted they could not grasp their meaning. The author warns that these symbols were designed to awaken a memory that had been deliberately buried, and that those who pursued them risked unearthing truths that could destabilize entire belief systems. This theme of dangerous memory recurs in multiple traditions. In one group of texts associated with a sect that lived in the desert margins of the ancient Levant, the scribes describe dreams in which colossal figures appeared at the boundary between sleep and waking. Gestures slow and deliberate, as though performing a ritual aimed at locking or unlocking something inside the dreamer's mind. The descriptions are too similar to dismiss. One scribe writes of a tall being whose skin shone like hammered bronze, while another describes a shape of impossible height, wrapped in shifting radiance. They do not present these visions as divine or metaphorical. They recount them with the solemnity of witnesses testifying to an event they do not fully understand. According to these texts, such visions often preceded periods of upheaval. Earthquakes, migrations, the collapse of cities, or the sudden emergence of new religious movements. Perhaps the most puzzling aspect of these writings is their persistent reference to cycles of intervention. The authors describe eras separated by immense spans of time, during which humanity developed independently until reaching a threshold that triggered another intrusion from whatever forces lurked beyond the margins. One writer claims that these intrusions were not random but calculated responses to a pattern observed by the watchers themselves. He likens humanity to a plant that grows towards the light, guided but also monitored, trimmed back when it grows too wildly. The metaphor is unsettling, implying not guidance but cultivation, as though humanity is part of a long-term project whose parameters remain hidden. Another forbidden manuscript, known only through citations in later works, describes an era when humanity spoke with the sky, a phrase scholars traditionally gloss as a poetic reference to prayer. Yet when viewed alongside other fragments, the meaning shifts. The author recounts nights when the air vibrated with a low hum, and luminous shapes drifted across the horizon. He claims that these shapes communicated through patterns of light that were understood instinctively rather than verbally. The idea seems impossible until you realize it parallels accounts from entirely different regions, accounts of luminous visitors whose presence could be felt as a pressure behind the eyes, a sensation that conveyed meaning without sound. One of the strangest elements in these texts is their treatment of time. Modern readers, accustomed to linear chronologies, struggle with the ancient author's fluid sense of temporal structure. They describe eras not in years or centuries, but in cycles, turnings, or ages beneath ages. Some texts imply that what we consider prehistory was merely one phase of a sequence stretching back long before the earliest archaeological evidence. One manuscript even hints that humanity existed in a different form before the current cycle, though the author's language is deliberately cryptic, as if constrained by fear or secrecy. He writes that the shape of man was not always as it is now, a statement that invites speculation yet offers no explanation. The forbidden writings also contain accounts of technologies or phenomena that resemble technologies, far beyond what their cultures should have known. One text mentions a wheel that turned in the sky without spokes, while another describes a mountain of metal that hummed like the breath of the earth. Skeptics argue these are metaphors, misinterpretations, or later interpolations. Yet their consistency across unrelated traditions suggests something more. It is possible these descriptions represent encounters with advanced artifacts left behind by earlier civilizations, civilizations erased by catastrophic events that the authors only dimly remembered. Or perhaps they reference encounters with entities whose abilities appeared technological to early humans, but were in fact something else entirely. What makes these descriptions even more intriguing is the emotional resonance they carry. The authors do not marvel at the phenomena they describe, they fear them. There is a sense of awe, yes, but also a deep unease, as though the visitors or devices represented not salvation, but judgment. Some texts describe communities attempting to flee the places where the radiant beings appeared, convinced that their arrival foreshadowed disaster. Others portray the beings as messengers delivering warnings about impending upheaval. One manuscript recounts an encounter in which a towering figure traced a line across the sky using a beam of light, marking the path of a coming catastrophe. The villagers, terrified, interpreted this as a sign that their valley would soon be destroyed. According to the text, they abandoned their settlement within days. A migration later recorded in the archaeological record without any clear explanation. This tension between revelation and destruction permeates the forbidden literature. The authors seem caught between gratitude for the knowledge bestowed upon them and dread of the price that knowledge demands. One writer admits he cannot distinguish between blessing and curse. He describes a moment when a radiant presence taught his people how to construct megalithic structures aligned with celestial patterns, promising these would help them survive the next great turning. Yet as he records the instructions, he confesses that he fears what will happen if humanity becomes too skilled at decoding the pattern. The implication is that knowledge is both gift and shackle, offered freely but monitored closely. This idea gains further support from another manuscript that describes an ancient council debating whether humanity should be granted certain teachings. The text portrays the council not as divine, but as a gathering of luminous figures whose authority derived from their mastery of cosmic cycles. They studied the trajectory of human development with what the author describes as a sorrowful patience, deliberating whether the next revelation would strengthen humanity or plunge it into chaos. Ultimately, the council decided to withhold certain teachings, fearing that humanity would misuse them. The manuscript ends abruptly, suggesting the scribe either stopped writing or the final portion was removed intentionally. Evidence of intentional removal appears throughout apocryphal literature. Many manuscripts contain gaps, abrupt transitions, or missing sections. Some fragments appear to have been edited by later authorities who feared their content might undermine doctrinal orthodoxy. Others may have been censored by the original scribes, who believed certain truths were too dangerous to record. This introduces an unsettling possibility that the version of history we inherit has been filtered through layers of suppression, distortion, and selective forgetting. The forbidden texts, then, become not merely alternative narratives, but windows into what was deliberately obscured. Archaeology occasionally offers corroboration. In remote regions, researchers have discovered petroglyphs depicting figures with elongated limbs, radiant halos, or devices resembling rods or discs. These images are often dismissed as symbolic representations of gods or celestial beings. Yet when compared to the descriptions in apocryphal writings, the parallels are striking. The same elongated forms, the same radiant halos, the same ambiguous gestures pointing toward the horizon or the sky. They appear across continents, cultures, and eras. This suggests a shared visual memory, one that transcends cultural boundaries and may reflect encounters with phenomena long forgotten by mainstream history. The forbidden texts do not limit themselves to encounters with radiant beings. They also describe ancient cataclysms with unnerving specificity. One manuscript recounts a night when the stars fell from their places, a phrase interpreted metaphorically until geological evidence revealed a prehistoric impact event in the region. Another text describes a wind that burned the skin, which echoes modern accounts of volcanic gases or even cosmic radiation. These descriptions may represent attempts by ancient authors to record real disasters using the limited vocabulary available to them. Yet the texts often attribute these catastrophes not to natural forces alone, but to cycles observed by watchers who intervened only when necessary. One of the most haunting texts speaks of an ancient city swallowed by the earth in a single night. Archaeologists have discovered settlements destroyed by sudden landslides or ground liquefaction, yet the text implies something more deliberate. The author describes vibrations that intensified throughout the day, culminating in a thunderous crack that split the ground open. He writes that prior to this, luminous figures appeared at the city's edge, gesturing urgently toward the surrounding hills as though urging residents to flee. Only a few heeded the warning. The rest perished beneath the collapsing earth. Skeptics may dismiss this as myth, yet the archaeological record does contain evidence of sudden, catastrophic collapses whose causes remain mysterious. A recurring theme in these texts is the idea that humanity once possessed knowledge of the cycles governing such disasters, but lost it through negligence or suppression. Some manuscripts describe ancient schools or sanctuaries where initiates studied celestial patterns, geological rhythms, and other forces shaping the world. These centers of learning were often hidden, accessible only to those who passed rigorous tests of discipline and humility. Their teachings emphasized balance, maintaining harmony between human ambition and cosmic forces. Yet many of these sanctuaries were destroyed during periods of political upheaval, religious reform, or natural disaster. Their knowledge survived only in fragments, preserved by scattered communities who incorporated them into their apocryphal writings. This fragmentation creates a peculiar effect. The forbidden texts often feel like the ruins of a once coherent system of knowledge, glimpses of a worldview that integrated cosmology, geology, astronomy, and metaphysics into a unified whole. The authors describe the universe as a living structure, governed by cycles that affect not only the physical world, but the evolution of consciousness itself. They portray humanity as participants in these cycles, influenced by forces both visible and unseen. And they hint that revelation, true revelation, is not a single event, but a recurring phenomenon that aligns with these cycles, appearing when the conditions are right. This raises profound questions. If revelation is cyclical, what triggers its return? The forbidden texts offer clues, but no definitive answer. Some manuscripts suggest that revelation occurs when humanity reaches a threshold of knowledge or complexity. Others imply it follows periods of immense chaos or destruction, emerging as a corrective force. Still others describe it as an inevitable part of cosmic rhythm, independent of human behavior. Yet all agree on one point. Revelation is disruptive. It shatters old beliefs, overturns established systems, and forces humanity to confront truths long buried. As you read these texts, a sense of foreboding grows. The authors did not view revelation as a comforting experience. They describe it as overwhelming, destabilizing, even terrifying. One writer recounts collapsing to the ground when confronted by a radiant presence, his mind flooded with images of distant eras and future catastrophes. Another claims he lost his ability to speak for 3 days after receiving a vision of the earth engulfed by storms of fire and water. These accounts, while subjective, convey the emotional intensity associated with revelation, an intensity that suggests the authors believed they were glimpsing something beyond human comprehension. The forbidden manuscripts often end abruptly, as though the authors reached the limits of what they could express. Some break off in mid-sentence, others transition suddenly to mundane topics, leaving the reader with the sense that something has been omitted. This pattern has puzzled scholars for centuries. It is possible the missing portions were lost through damage or neglect. But another possibility emerges from the texts themselves: that the authors withheld certain details intentionally. Several manuscripts include warnings about the dangers of sharing certain knowledge, claiming it could awaken forces that should remain sleeping. These warnings, while enigmatic, suggest that the authors believed some truths were too potent for general dissemination. And yet, they preserved fragments, enough to hint at a larger narrative, enough to inspire future seekers to piece together the hidden history. This balancing act between revelation and concealment defines the forbidden texts. They offer glimpses of a world shaped by luminous beings, ancient cycles, catastrophic upheavals, and knowledge that transcends ordinary understanding. But they never reveal everything. They leave space for speculation, interpretation, and perhaps discovery. The deeper you immerse yourself in these writings, the more you sense a presence moving just beyond the edge of the narrative. A presence that watches, waits, and occasionally intervenes. The authors felt it. They wrote as though aware of eyes upon them, as though their words were both permitted and monitored. They describe visions arriving unbidden, messages delivered through dreams or sudden flashes of insight. They portray themselves not as creators of these revelations, but as conduits, channels through which ancient truths were transmitted. This raises an unsettling hypothesis: that the forbidden texts were not merely human creations, but collaborations between humanity and forces that have guided its trajectory across multiple cycles. Whether these forces are divine, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or something else entirely remains a matter of interpretation. But the consistency of the accounts suggests they are not figments of imagination. They represent encounters with intelligences whose motives remain opaque, but whose influence on human history may be far greater than we realize. When you move into the next layer of the forbidden texts, a profound shift occurs, not in their content alone, but in the way they frame humanity's relationship to knowledge itself. Up to this point, the fragments seem to depict revelation as an event, sudden, disruptive, and often accompanied by luminous visitors who impart warnings or teachings. But deeper in the manuscripts, the tone changes. Revelation begins to appear not as an event, but as a condition, something woven into the structure of existence, a kind of pulse that beats beneath history. The ancient scribes describe it as a presence that never truly leaves, even when the world moves on, as though nothing extraordinary has happened. To them, revelation is not a moment, but a return, a reminder of truths once known, but long forgotten. One manuscript preserved in a monastery claims that revelation moves through the world like a wandering star, appearing at intervals determined not by human behavior, but by forces far beyond human scale. The writer suggests that civilizations rise and fall not merely because of political or environmental pressures, but because they align, or fail to align, with this returning presence. When revelation draws near, the boundaries between worlds thin, allowing ancient memories to resurface. The manuscript describes these moments as times when the air becomes heavy with remembrance, when dreams take on a clarity that feels more real than waking life, and when the old symbols glow faintly in the mind's eye. The author insists that these symbols are keys, not metaphors, and that those who learn to interpret them can glimpse the architecture of the cycles shaping humanity's fate. Another text from a different region amplifies this perspective. The scribe recounts a vision in which he is shown a vast wheel suspended in darkness, its spokes representing epochs of human development. At the end of each spoke, he sees a doorway shimmering with light. When he asks what lies beyond the doorways, a voice replies that each one opens into a different version of humanity's potential, a path that could unfold if a particular revelation is embraced or rejected. The vision frightens him. He admits he cannot grasp the meaning, yet he writes with a certainty that the wheel exists not in space, but in consciousness, a pattern that repeats across all ages. He claims that during certain turnings, the wheel spins faster, generating turbulence in the world. Wars ignite, empires expand and collapse, knowledge spreads or contracts. He believes these moments of acceleration precede a great unveiling, though he warns that unveiling can bring either renewal or destruction, depending on humanity's readiness. This sense of readiness becomes a recurring theme. The forbidden texts question whether humanity has ever truly been prepared for the revelations it has received. Some manuscripts imply that the early civilizations did not simply collapse because of natural disasters, but because the knowledge they were given proved too destabilizing. One writer describes a community that attempted to harness a teaching passed down by radiant beings, only to unleash forces that tore their society apart. He calls this the burden of understanding, a phrase that recurs in later texts. The implication is troubling, that revelation is inherently dangerous, not because of its source, but because of humanity's tendency toward hubris. Other manuscripts soften this view, portraying the radiant figures not as stern judges, but as sorrowful guides who long to help humanity, but cannot interfere too directly. One scribe recounts a deeply moving encounter between a village elder and a luminous being who appears during a time of famine. The being does not offer food or perform miracles. Instead, it instructs the elder in constructing a device that channels water from an underground spring. The elder obeys, but when he returns the next morning, the being is gone. The village survives, yet the elder is tormented by the realization that the being could have saved them with far less effort. He eventually concludes that the being was bound by laws beyond his understanding, laws that require humanity to participate in its own survival, even when the cost is suffering. These stories reveal a tension at the heart of the forbidden texts, a sense that humanity is not alone, yet not fully supported either. The Watchers, as some manuscripts call them, appear to operate under constraints, intervening only in ways that preserve human agency. They offer guidance, but they do not shield humanity from consequence. This dynamic suggests a complex relationship in which revelation serves both as a catalyst for growth and as a test of character. The ancient writers grappled with this duality, often expressing frustration or confusion. They sensed that the Watchers were neither gods nor indifferent observers, but something in between. Beings invested in humanity's trajectory, but unwilling or unable to dictate it outright. A particularly enigmatic manuscript describes a gathering known as the Night of Questions, during which a group of scribes sought to understand why the Watchers had withdrawn from their world. The text recounts that they fasted and prayed for 7 days before receiving a collective vision. In this vision, they saw a vast landscape filled with mirrors suspended in darkness. Each mirror reflected a different civilization, some thriving, others in ruin. The scribes realized that the Watchers had not abandoned them, but were observing from a distance, waiting to see which reflection humanity would choose to become. They understood that intervention would come only when a civilization's trajectory threatened the integrity of the larger cycle. Yet even this intervention would be limited, designed not to save humanity, but to redirect it. The notion of cycles recurs with increasing frequency in later manuscripts, often linked to celestial patterns. The writers note that revelation tends to coincide with specific astronomical alignments, rare positions of planets, significant eclipses, or irregular movements of stars. Some manuscripts suggest that the Watchers use these alignments as windows through which to communicate or intervene. Others imply that the alignments themselves generate the thinning of boundaries that allow revelation to occur. A few texts propose an even more radical idea, that ancient structures scattered across the world, stone circles, pyramids, underground chambers, were built not only as observatories, but as anchors designed to stabilize the world during these periods of cosmic turbulence. According to these writings, revelation is not merely psychological or spiritual. It has physical consequences, capable of altering the Earth's magnetic field, triggering geological upheavals, or influencing human behavior on a massive scale. Such claims seem fantastical until you examine the archaeological evidence that occasionally aligns with them. Ancient sites often exhibit signs of reconstruction across multiple eras, suggesting they were used repeatedly for purposes that transcend any single culture. Some structures appear oriented toward celestial events, occurring only once every several thousand years. The texts imply that their builders understood these cycles and sought to preserve the knowledge for future generations, even if they knew the meaning would inevitably erode over time. One scribe laments that the symbols carved into stone would one day be interpreted as decoration rather than instruction, and that the teachings of the Watchers would be reduced to myth. This erosion is evident in the way the forbidden texts themselves were treated. As centuries passed, many of these manuscripts were hidden, suppressed, or dismissed by religious authorities who feared their implications. Some writings challenged established doctrine by suggesting that humanity's relationship with the divine was not unique, but part of a broader cosmic cycle. Others implied that revelation did not originate from a single source, but from multiple realms or dimensions. These ideas threatened the theological frameworks that held societies together, prompting leaders to ban or destroy the texts. Yet fragments survived, copied secretly by scribes who believed the ancient knowledge should not vanish entirely. Their preservation efforts, though incomplete, created a network of documents that modern scholars continue to decipher. As you read these fragments, the character of Revelation becomes increasingly complex. It is no longer a simple matter of divine intervention or supernatural visitation. Instead, it appears as a phenomenon that operates across multiple layers of reality, touching consciousness, society, and the natural world. Some manuscripts portray revelation as a force that awakens latent abilities within humanity: intuition, creativity, the capacity to perceive patterns hidden in ordinary experience. Others describe it as a disruptive force that strips away illusions, exposing truths that societies would rather ignore. These texts emphasize that revelation is never comfortable or convenient. It arrives at moments of crisis, demanding transformation. This demand for transformation appears most vividly in a manuscript known as the Chronicle of the Silent Witness, which describes an era of profound instability. The writer claims he lived through a period when the Watchers no longer appeared openly, yet their influence could be felt everywhere, in the intensifying storms, the shifting migrations of animals, the sudden emergence of new philosophies. He describes the world as being on the verge of a threshold, a moment when the structures that upheld society began to crumble. During this time, he experienced visions of a vast figure standing on the horizon, its form partially obscured by darkness. The figure did not speak, yet the writer felt it beckoning him to witness events unfolding beyond the reach of ordinary perception. He describes feeling both terror and awe, sensing that he was being prepared for a revelation that would reshape his understanding of existence. What makes this text particularly striking is its claim that revelation does not always come from external beings. The writer insists that humanity possesses the capacity to generate its own revelations, triggered by moments of collective despair or enlightenment. He describes a phenomenon he calls the inner turning, during which individuals across vast distances experience simultaneous insights, dreams, or awakenings. These shared experiences, he argues, are not coincidences, but manifestations of a deeper, communal consciousness linked to the cycles governing the world. This idea anticipates modern theories about collective unconsciousness or global intuitive shifts, suggesting that ancient authors perceived patterns we are only beginning to understand. Yet the Chronicle also warns of the dangers inherent in this process. The writer claims that during times of inner turning, societies become vulnerable to manipulation, not only by external forces, but by their own fears and desires. He describes leaders who exploited the confusion to consolidate power, prophets who claimed false revelations, and factions that interpreted the visions in ways that fueled conflict. The writer laments that humanity often misreads the signs, failing to distinguish between genuine revelation and illusions born of fear. This leads to cycles of chaos that threaten to derail the larger cosmic rhythm. Other manuscripts echo this theme, emphasizing the importance of discernment. One scribe writes that revelation speaks in a voice without sound, meaning it must be perceived not through external authority, but through inner clarity. Yet he warns that few possess the discipline required to hear this voice accurately. He describes a group of initiates trained to interpret the signs, individuals chosen for their humility and wisdom. These initiates, according to the text, served as intermediaries between the Watchers and humanity. They recorded the teachings, maintained the ancient observatories, and guided communities through periods of upheaval. But over time, their lineage fractured, their knowledge dispersed, and their role diminished. The forbidden texts, then, become remnants of their teachings, a scattered archive that preserves their insights but lacks the coherence of the original system. As you examine these writings, you notice that the Watchers themselves remain enigmatic. They are described as tall, radiant, and possessing an intelligence that transcends human categories. Yet the manuscripts rarely depict them as omnipotent or omniscient. Instead, they appear bound by constraints, rules governing when and how they can intervene. Some texts suggest these rules are self-imposed, part of an ethical framework that respects human autonomy. Others imply the constraints are external, imposed by higher forces or cosmic laws. This raises questions about the hierarchy of beings implied in the manuscripts. If the Watchers are not the highest authority, what lies above them? Some texts refer to the deep, the source, or the silent throne, but offer no clear explanation. These terms may represent metaphysical concepts rather than actual entities, yet their consistent use across multiple traditions hints at a shared cosmology that remains largely hidden. The forbidden manuscripts also describe realms beyond the physical world, dimensions or planes where the Watchers reside. These realms are depicted as places of light, sound, or pure consciousness, accessible only through altered states or extreme ritual practices. Several texts recount journeys undertaken by shamans, priests, or scribes who claimed to travel to these realms through dreams or trance. Their descriptions vary, yet they share core elements: corridors of shimmering energy, landscapes that shift with thought, and beings composed of light. Some writers insist these journeys were literal, while others present them as symbolic representations of inner transformation. Regardless of interpretation, the accounts reveal a belief that revelation originates not from the physical world, but from a deeper layer of reality. One of the most poetic manuscripts describes revelation as the breath between worlds, a force that moves through dimensions, touching those who are receptive. The text claims that the Watchers act as conductors of this breath, guiding it toward civilizations in need of transformation. Yet the author warns that revelation can also bring destruction if received improperly. He likens it to fire, capable of illumination or ruin depending on how it is used. This metaphor recurs throughout apocryphal literature, suggesting a shared understanding of revelation's dual nature. As you synthesize these fragments, a striking picture emerges. The forbidden texts present a cosmology in which humanity is part of an interconnected system governed by cycles of revelation, intervention, and transformation. The Watchers appear as intermediaries between realms, tasked with guiding humanity through periods of upheaval while respecting its autonomy. Ancient structures, symbols, and rituals serve as tools for preserving knowledge across cycles, and revelation itself is portrayed not as a singular event, but as a recurring pulse that reshapes the world. Yet, despite this profound framework, the manuscripts repeatedly express concern that humanity has lost the ability to interpret the signs. The writers lament that their societies have grown disconnected from the rhythms of the world, distracted by material concerns and political conflicts. They warn that when revelation returns, and it always returns, it may arrive in a world unprepared to receive it. This fear haunts the texts, giving them an urgency that resonates even now. There is a moment in the forbidden texts when the tone shifts again. Subtly at first, then with a force that alters the entire trajectory of what the manuscripts seem to be describing. Up to this point, the writings present revelation as something cyclical, as a recurring pulse guiding humanity through epochs of growth and collapse. But deeper in the archive, the texts begin to suggest that revelation is not only cyclical, but accumulative. Each cycle deposits something into the human story, like sediment layered at the bottom of an ancient sea. These deposits, fragments of knowledge, symbols, architectures, rituals, form the bedrock of civilizations long after the original revelation has faded from memory. It is here that the manuscripts begin to resemble not just testimonies of encounters with radiant beings or cosmic cycles, but blueprints for understanding the evolution of human consciousness itself. One manuscript describes humanity as a vessel designed to hold increasing degrees of awareness. The writer claims that in the earliest ages, humanity was like a shallow cup, unable to contain more than the most basic revelations without shattering. Over time, the vessel expanded. Its capacity increased through trial, hardship, and the slow accumulation of wisdom. The radiant visitors, according to this text, played a role in shaping the vessel, strengthening it so it could withstand greater revelations in future cycles. Yet the manuscript also warns that expansion is not guaranteed. If humanity becomes rigid, fearful, or dependent on old knowledge, the vessel can crack under the pressure of new revelation. This idea creates an unsettling framework. Revelation is not simply a gift or a burden, but a stress test that humanity must continually pass to survive and evolve. Another fragment expands on this metaphor by describing ancient civilizations as prototypes, early experiments in shaping the vessel of humanity. The scribe recounts cities of stone built according to geometric patterns that mirrored the structure of the cosmos. He claims that these cities acted as tuning forks, amplifying the resonance of revelation and distributing it across wide regions. The inhabitants of these cities, he writes, lived in harmony with celestial cycles, aligning their rituals with the movements of the stars. But the scribe also admits that these civilizations were fragile. When the cycles shifted, or when human ambition outpaced wisdom, the tuning forks fell out of alignment. The cities collapsed, not purely from external catastrophes, but from internal dissonance, an imbalance between the vessel's capacity and the revelation trying to fill it. This theme of dissonance reverberates through the forbidden literature. Manuscripts from entirely different cultures hint at civilizations undone not by ignorance or barbarism, but by their inability to integrate the revelations thrust upon them. One text describes a society that achieved remarkable technological and spiritual advancements, only to fracture when different factions interpreted the revelations in conflicting ways. Some saw them as instructions to expand outward, exploring new horizons. Others viewed them as warnings demanding withdrawal and introspection. The resulting conflict destabilized their world, leading to a collapse remembered in later myths as divine punishment. The manuscript portrays the radiant beings not as destroyers, but as mourners, watching helplessly as humanity failed another test of integration. A later text describes revelation as a mirror held up to humanity. It reflects not only the cosmic order, but the flaws within the human psyche. The writer claims that when a revelation occurs, it magnifies whatever lies dormant in the collective mind: wisdom or fear, compassion or violence. He gives the example of a village visited by a radiant presence. Half the villagers experienced visions of unity and renewal, while the other half were consumed by paranoia, interpreting the presence as a threat. This division escalated into conflict, resulting in the village's destruction. The radiant figure, according to the text, appeared once more amid the ruins, not to judge, but to record the outcome. The writer suggests that revelation does not create division, it exposes the division already present. One of the most enigmatic manuscripts discusses a concept known as the veil of consciousness. The author claims that humanity is surrounded by a thin membrane, separating ordinary perception from deeper truths. During cycles of revelation, the veil becomes permeable, allowing insights and visions to flow through. But the veil also protects humanity, preventing overwhelming knowledge from destabilizing societies. The writer suggests that the Watchers control the permeability of the veil, adjusting it based on humanity's readiness. When societies mature, the veil thins. When fear dominates, the veil thickens once more. This dynamic, according to the text, governs the rhythm of human evolution more than any political or technological development. Another manuscript describes how the veil interacts with the natural world. The scribe recounts that during periods when the veil thins, the environment becomes more responsive to human consciousness. He claims that storms intensify when fear spreads through a population, and clear skies persist when harmony prevails. While metaphorical interpretations are tempting, the manuscript provides detailed accounts of weather phenomena occurring simultaneously with large-scale social upheavals. It suggests that ancient people perceived the world as a conscious partner in their evolution, responding to collective emotion in ways that modern science might describe through different mechanisms. Whether literal or symbolic, the text conveys a world view in which humanity, nature, and the Watchers are entwined in an intricate dance shaped by revelation. The forbidden texts also introduce the idea of thresholds of no return, moments when a civilization reaches a point beyond which its trajectory cannot be altered. According to one manuscript, these thresholds occur when humanity misinterprets revelation so profoundly that the vessel cracks, releasing chaos that consumes the foundations of society. The writer describes an ancient empire that misread the signs of an impending cycle. Believing the radiant beings to be harbingers of conquest rather than transformation, the empire launched a preemptive war against neighboring regions. This act, driven by fear and misunderstanding, destabilized the land. Earthquakes shook the capital, and floods submerged its outlying villages. The manuscript implies that the disasters were not random, but triggered by the empire's resistance to the revelation. The Watchers, bound by their constraints, did not intervene directly. Instead, they allowed the consequences to unfold, preserving the integrity of the larger cycle even as the empire collapsed. This raises a profound question. Is revelation a test designed to evaluate humanity, or is it simply part of a cosmic mechanism indifferent to human suffering? The forbidden texts do not provide a unified answer. Some manuscripts portray the Watchers as compassionate beings who guide humanity with patience and sorrow. Others depict them as cosmic engineers, maintaining a system far larger than human experience. Still others hint that the Watchers themselves are subject to higher laws, acting within a hierarchy of beings whose motives remain unknown. This ambiguity reinforces the sense that revelation operates across multiple dimensions, touching human lives while also serving purposes that transcend them. A manuscript attributed to an exiled priest introduces a chilling possibility. Revelation may not always be benevolent. The priest describes a vision in which he saw a fractured light descending from the sky. Unlike the radiant beings described in earlier texts, this light was chaotic, flickering wildly and producing dissonant vibrations. Wherever it touched the ground, plants withered, animals fled, and people became disoriented. The priest claims that this was not a revelation sent by the Watchers, but a distortion, an intrusion from a realm outside the cosmic cycle. He warns that not all revelations are genuine, and that humanity must learn to distinguish between the true pulse and the aberrations. This notion introduces a darker layer to the forbidden manuscripts, suggesting that the thinning of the veil can allow both wisdom and deception to enter the world. What makes this warning particularly unnerving is its resonance with other texts that describe false revelations. One manuscript recounts a group of prophets who received visions urging them to build a massive tower, claiming it would allow them to join the Watchers in the heavens. The prophets convinced their community to undertake the construction, pouring their resources into its foundation. But as the tower rose, the visions grew more distorted, leading to confusion and conflict. The manuscript hints that the prophets were influenced not by the true Watchers, but by an echo, a reflection of revelation warped by human desire. The tower eventually collapsed during a violent storm, leaving the survivors to wonder whether their ambition had drawn disaster upon them. While this story echoes later myth, the original manuscript presents it with a tone of caution rather than moral judgment. Another fragment suggests that these distortions occur when the veil thins prematurely, when humanity forces access to deeper truths without proper preparation. The writer describes rituals performed by desperate communities seeking guidance during times of famine or war. These rituals, he claims, sometimes tore the veil open rather than thinning it gently. The resulting flood of visions overwhelmed the participants, leading to madness or despair. The text warns that revelation cannot be summoned by force. It must arrive naturally in accordance with the cosmic cycle. Attempts to accelerate the process risk inviting chaotic forces that mimic revelation but lack its coherence and purpose. The forbidden writings also explore the idea that certain individuals are more attuned to revelation than others. These individuals, described as seers or dreamwalkers, possess an innate sensitivity to the thinning of the veil. They experience visions even during periods when the cycles are dormant. Some manuscripts portray these individuals as chosen, others as cursed. They often struggle to articulate their experiences, trapped between worlds that do not fully accept them. In one poignant text, a seer describes feeling like a vessel filled with light too intense to contain. He writes that he hears whispers in the wind, sees symbols woven into the patterns of clouds, and feels the presence of the Watchers even in moments of solitude. Yet his community treats him with suspicion, fearing that his visions signal an impending catastrophe. Another manuscript recounts a group of seers who formed a hidden order dedicated to preserving the true teachings of revelation. They traveled across regions, studying ancient structures, decoding symbols, and recording their insights in encrypted manuscripts. The text claims that these seers believed the cycles were accelerating, that the veil was thinning more rapidly than in previous ages. They warned that humanity stood on the brink of a major turning, one that would challenge its understanding of reality. Their writings urge future generations to prepare not only technologically or politically, but spiritually, to cultivate the inner clarity needed to discern true revelation from false. This emphasis on discernment reflects a growing anxiety in the late forbidden texts. As the cycles progress, the manuscripts become increasingly concerned with the possibility of misinterpretation. Writers describe societies overwhelmed by conflicting visions, unable to distinguish between authentic guidance and illusions produced by fear or ambition. Some texts even suggest that the watchers themselves may struggle to communicate clearly during periods of cosmic turbulence. The radiant figures, once described with serene certainty, begin to appear as flickering shapes or fragmented images. The messages they deliver become harder to interpret, their gestures more ambiguous. Whether this reflects a real shift in the watcher's nature or simply the instability of the cycle is left unclear. Yet amid this uncertainty, the manuscripts offer moments of profound hope. One text describes a future age in which humanity finally integrates the revelations accumulated across cycles. The scribe envisions a world where the veil becomes a living membrane, flexible and responsive, allowing humanity to navigate between dimensions without losing its grounding. In this world, ancient structures hum with renewed energy, symbols long forgotten glow once more, and the watchers walk openly among humans, not as guides or judges, but as collaborators in a shared journey. The manuscript ends with a vision of the world bathed in a soft, radiant light, its contours shifting to reflect the unity between realms. But other texts temper this optimism with caution. A fragment from a different tradition warns that the integration of revelation is not guaranteed. It describes a path splitting into two futures, one where humanity rises to meet the revelation, and another where it collapses under the weight of its own fear. The writer insists that the outcome depends not on the will of the watchers, but on the choices humanity makes in the face of uncertainty. He concludes with a haunting observation. Revelation does not choose between hope and despair. It merely reveals what already exists. As you trace the arc of these forbidden manuscripts, the portrait they paint becomes increasingly complex. Revelation emerges as a force both ancient and evolving, guiding humanity through cycles of transformation while responding to the consequences of its choices. The Watchers appear as guardians bound by cosmic laws, offering guidance but withholding control. Humanity stands at the center of this cosmic dance, shaped by revelation, yet responsible for interpreting it, integrating it, and surviving it. As you descend even further into the forgotten layers of the apocryphal manuscripts, the tone darkens in a way that feels more like an environmental shift than a literary one. The texts begin to pulse with an urgency that seems to reflect not merely the anxieties of their authors, but the pressures of the cycle itself, an immensity approaching, a hinge of time beginning to creak open. These writings no longer speak only of revelation as memory or guidance. Instead, they hint at something far more unsettling: the convergence of multiple revelations, a moment when the boundaries between realms weaken simultaneously across vast regions of the world. The ancient scribes feared these convergences because they believed humanity was exposed during them, stripped of the protective layers that ordinarily shielded it from forces it could not comprehend. They describe these periods as nights within nights, moments when the veil grew dangerously thin and the watchers themselves appeared uneasy, as though confronting powers older than their own. One manuscript from a mountain sanctuary claims that during such a convergence, time itself becomes unstable. The writer recounts seeing shadows move in ways that contradicted the position of the sun, footsteps echoing seconds before they were made, and dreams bleeding into waking life. He insists that his experiences were not hallucinations brought on by isolation or fasting, but signs of a deeper temporal fracture. According to him, the convergence marked a moment when the linear flow of time wavered, allowing glimpses of past cycles to intrude on the present. He describes seeing a figure from a forgotten age standing beside him before dissolving into mist, and hearing chants in languages no longer spoken. These visions terrified him, yet he believed they were essential to understanding the magnitude of what revelation truly represented. In his view, revelation was not merely a message or an encounter, but an alignment of temporal layers, an opportunity to witness all of humanity's forgotten epochs converging into a single moment of clarity. Another text, written centuries later in a distant region, echoes this theme with uncanny precision. The author, a wandering mystic, recounts traveling through a valley where people reported hearing voices in the wind, voices that spoke in perfect unison, yet came from multiple directions at once. The mystic describes how the villagers believed these voices belonged to their ancestors, returning to warn them of an impending upheaval. But the mystic sensed something different. He writes that the voices were not limited to the dead. Some spoke of events that had not yet occurred, while others spoke of eras so ancient the villagers had no words to describe them. He concluded that the valley stood at the edge of a convergence, one that blurred the boundaries between past, present, and future. The mystic observed that animals behaved strangely, gathering in silent clusters and staring at the horizon as though anticipating something monumental. The villagers eventually fled, leaving behind a settlement that later fell into ruin. Modern archaeologists note the sudden abandonment, but cannot explain it, unaware that an ancient manuscript once described the valley as a fracture point, where revelation pressed too close to the world. Such accounts suggest that convergences represent not merely moments of increased spiritual activity, but structural weaknesses in the fabric of reality. The forbidden texts describe them as thresholds where humanity comes perilously close to encountering forces beyond the reach of even the Watchers, forces that existed before the cycles began and may outlast them. One manuscript, attributed to a scholar priest, describes these forces as currents beneath creation, likening them to deep ocean tides that shape the surface world without ever being seen. He warns that revelations emerging from these depths carry a weight far greater than humanity can bear. The scholar priest recounts a vision in which he saw a luminous figure trembling before a colossal shadow stretching across the sky. The figure, though radiant, appeared diminished, its light flickering as if drained by the presence of the shadow. The manuscript ends with the cryptic statement, "Even the watchers have watchers." This line, written in trembling script, suggests a hierarchy of beings far more complex than traditional myths allow. Another thread woven through the forbidden texts is the idea that humanity occasionally intersects with these deeper forces by accident. Certain sites, mountaintops, caves, ancient observatories, serve as natural conduits where the veil is thinner even outside periods of convergence. Some manuscripts claim that early humans discovered these places by instinct, sensing the subtle vibrations emanating from them. They built sanctuaries, temples, or stone circles atop these sites, believing them to be sacred. Yet the forbidden texts imply that these structures were not merely places of worship, but attempts to stabilize the veil, to regulate the flow of revelation so it would not overwhelm the communities that lived nearby. One manuscript describes an ancient council that constructed a network of stone towers aligned with the stars. These towers, according to the text, emitted a harmonic resonance that calmed the surrounding land, preventing erratic visions and disturbances. The towers acted like tuning devices, synchronizing human consciousness with the cycles of revelation. But as centuries passed and knowledge eroded, later generations misinterpreted the towers' purpose, dismantled them, or repurposed the stones for mundane uses. The text mournfully notes that without these devices, the land became increasingly unstable, leading to a series of disasters that ultimately erased the civilization entirely. This theme of forgotten technology appears in multiple manuscripts. Some describe ancient devices capable of altering the flow of energy within a region, redirecting currents that the writers believed were essential to maintaining the balance between realms. These devices are often depicted as stone structures containing metallic components, rods, discs, or crystalline elements. The manuscripts describe hums or vibrations emanating from them during periods of heightened activity. Modern scholars dismiss these accounts as myth, but the forbidden texts insist that the devices were real and that they were created with the guidance of the Watchers. One writer claims that the Watchers taught early humans how to construct these devices not as weapons or tools of power, but as safeguards, ensuring that revelation would unfold gradually rather than catastrophically. However, the text also warns that when these devices malfunction or fall into disrepair, the consequences can be dire. This raises a troubling possibility that some ancient cataclysms recorded in myth may not have been purely natural, but were byproducts of failed attempts to regulate revelation. A manuscript from a coastal civilization describes a great temple built atop a cliff, containing a circular chamber lined with metal plates. According to the scribe, the chamber amplified the energies of the veil during periods of convergence, allowing the priesthood to interpret the signs with clarity. But the chamber required constant maintenance, and as political turmoil swept through the region, the priesthood was disbanded. The chamber fell silent, its mechanisms corroded by time. When the next convergence occurred, the chamber malfunctioned, intensifying the energies rather than stabilizing them. The scribe recounts that the sky darkened, the sea roared, and the cliff split open, swallowing the temple and much of the city. The survivors fled inland, carrying only fragments of the teachings. Their descendants remembered the event as divine wrath, unaware that their ancestors had once understood the mechanics behind the catastrophe. Other manuscripts point to subtler but equally profound consequences of neglected safeguards. One describes a forest region where the veil grew dangerously thin, causing hunters to see luminous figures drifting between the trees. The figures did not attack, but their presence created confusion. Some hunters disappeared, claiming they had followed lights into realms from which they could not return. The manuscript suggests that the watchers attempted to intervene indirectly, sending signs to warn the villagers. Yet without the ancient devices to regulate the veil, their efforts were limited. Eventually, a group of wanderers arrived and restored a portion of an old stone structure hidden beneath the roots of a massive tree. The manuscript claims that once the structure was reactivated, the forest grew quieter and the luminous figures became rarer. Whether symbolic or literal, the story conveys a consistent theme. Ancient technologies, once understood, played a crucial role in mediating humanity's interaction with the unseen world. But the forbidden texts do not portray humanity solely as passive recipients of guidance from the Watchers. They also depict humans as active participants in shaping the cycles. Some manuscripts describe individuals whose insights, inventions, or visions altered the trajectory of an entire civilization. These individuals are often portrayed as possessing an innate resonance with the cycles, a kind of attunement that allowed them to interpret revelations more clearly than others. One manuscript describes a woman whose dreams revealed the movement of celestial bodies with extraordinary accuracy. She convinced her community to construct a stone observatory aligned with a rare stellar configuration. According to the text, the observatory became a nexus for revelation, attracting radiant figures who imparted teachings that sustained the civilization for centuries. Yet when the woman died, the knowledge she carried faded, and the observatory fell into disrepair. The manuscript implies that certain individuals serve as anchors for revelation, their presence stabilizing the flow of knowledge in a way that structures alone cannot. Another text recounts the life of a man who wandered the deserts, guided by visions of a luminous city existing in a realm adjacent to his own. He spent decades carving symbols into stone, claiming that the Watchers instructed him to preserve these signs for a future age. His community dismissed him as mad, but centuries later, explorers discovered the stones buried beneath shifting sands. The symbols, when compared with other apocryphal manuscripts, revealed patterns linking multiple cycles together. The man's work, once disregarded, became a crucial key in deciphering the deeper architecture of revelation. This suggests that humanity's role in the cycles is not merely to receive, but to preserve, to embed fragments of revelation in forms that can survive the collapse of civilizations. This interplay between human agency and cosmic influence becomes even more fascinating in texts that describe collective revelation. Some manuscripts suggest that entire communities can become attuned to the cycles, experiencing shared visions or insights that propel them toward transformation. One text recounts a village where every inhabitant dreamed the same dream on the same night, a vision of a great wave approaching from the east. The villagers interpreted the dream as a warning and relocated inland. Weeks later, a tsunami struck the coast, destroying their former home. The manuscript does not present this as prophecy, but as an example of collective attunement, suggesting that during certain phases of the cycle, human consciousness becomes interconnected, allowing entire populations to perceive threats or opportunities that would otherwise remain hidden. However, not all collective revelations lead to salvation. Another text describes a city where the population became overwhelmed by a shared vision of imminent destruction. Panic spread, social order collapsed, and the city's leaders struggled to maintain control. The catastrophe never materialized, yet the fear generated by the vision caused the city's downfall. The manuscript suggests that the vision may have been a distortion, a false revelation triggered by instability in the veil. This highlights the delicate balance between guidance and misguidance, between authentic insight and illusion. The forbidden texts warn repeatedly that revelation must be interpreted with discernment, that its power can uplift or destroy depending on the clarity of those who receive it. The later manuscripts express growing concern that humanity is approaching another convergence, a period when revelations from multiple cycles may overlap. The writers describe signs of this approach: increased instability in natural systems, widespread prophetic dreams, and the reactivation of ancient sites believed to have been dormant for centuries. They claim that the Watchers appear more frequently during such times, though their forms become harder to perceive. One writer describes encountering a radiant figure whose outline flickered like a flame in the wind, as though struggling to maintain coherence. The figure did not speak, but the writer sensed an overwhelming sadness emanating from it. He interpreted this as a warning that the coming convergence would test humanity in ways that no previous cycle had. Another manuscript describes a phenomenon known as the dawn without horizon. The text claims that during a convergence, light may appear in the sky without a discernible source, an illumination that neither rises nor sets. The writer recounts seeing this light spread across the landscape, casting no shadows, yet revealing details normally invisible to the naked eye. He describes seeing patterns etched into stone, glowing briefly before fading again. The villagers interpreted the light as a sign that the Watchers had returned, but the writer cautioned that it might signify the arrival of forces beyond their understanding. He believed that the dawn without horizon marked the thinning of boundaries between realms, an omen of both revelation and danger. As the forbidden texts weave these threads together, a complex picture emerges, one in which revelation is not merely a divine message or supernatural visitation, but an intrinsic part of the world's structure. It interacts with geology, consciousness, architecture, and time itself. The Watchers appear not as omnipotent beings, but as participants in a larger system that they do not fully control. Humanity, for its part, stands at the crossroads of this system, capable of rising to meet revelation or collapsing under its weight. It becomes clear, reading these texts, that the cycles are not isolated events, but chapters in a much longer narrative, one that humanity has been living unconsciously for millennia. The forbidden manuscripts are fragments of that narrative, preserved by individuals and communities who believed the knowledge must survive even as civilizations fell. They paint a story of a world shaped not by chance or simple chronology, but by recurring pulses of revelation that sculpt the trajectory of nations, cultures, and consciousness. And beneath all of this lies a deeper tension, an unspoken question that the ancient scribes never dared to articulate fully. What happens when the cycles reach their limit? What occurs when revelation has accumulated beyond the vessel's capacity? When the veil thins not in one location or during one epoch, but across the entire world? The forbidden texts offer no definitive answer. Some imply a great transformation, a merging of realms that elevates humanity to a new state of being. Others warn of collapse on an unprecedented scale, one that resets not merely civilizations, but the cycles themselves. Still others suggest that the Watchers, too, await this moment with apprehension, uncertain of their role in what is to come. The manuscripts end not with certainty, but with anticipation. As the forbidden manuscripts move toward their final layers, a quiet but unmistakable shift emerges. The tone becomes heavier, almost gravitational, as though the writers felt the weight of something approaching from beyond the margins of their world. Earlier texts spoke of cycles, convergences, and revelations with a kind of distant awe, as if describing weather patterns observed from afar. But in these later writings, revelation becomes personal, intimate, almost invasive. It is no longer a cosmic rhythm brushing against the edges of human history, but a force stepping directly into it, altering the minds, bodies, and fates of the individuals who dared to record its presence. One scribe writes that revelation, in its purest form, does not illuminate, but unravels. He describes his experiences not as moments of understanding, but as sensations of being dismantled, piece by piece, until his identity felt both expanded and dissolved. He claims he saw his own life from outside, as though standing behind time and watching the shape of his existence ripple across the years. He insists these were not dreams or hallucinations, because they carried a clarity sharper than waking thought. He writes that revelation stripped away the narrative he had constructed about his life, revealing patterns he had never noticed, coincidences that were not coincidences, choices that were not choices, but threads woven by forces older than memory. Another manuscript expands on this internal dimension of revelation. The writer describes a sensation of hearing a second voice beneath his own, a quiet whisper that spoke truths he always knew but never acknowledged. This whisper did not instruct or command. It simply affirmed. It told him that revelation begins not with external signs, but with the recognition that everything he believed about the world was incomplete. The writer claims that the radiant figures he once perceived as external beings were reflections of something unfolding within him, symbols or projections used by the Watchers to communicate through a medium the human mind could understand. He warns, however, that this internal manifestation of revelation is the most dangerous form, because it blurs the line between insight and obsession. Without discipline, the seeker may lose himself in visions that feel profound but stem from unresolved fear or desire rather than genuine truth. This warning becomes a recurring motif in the final manuscripts. They portray revelation as a double-edged phenomenon, one that elevates the prepared but unravels the unprepared. One scribe recounts a village where dozens of people experienced simultaneous visions of a radiant city emerging from the horizon. Some interpreted the vision as a sign to leave their homes and journey towards the mountains. Others saw it as a warning to stay and fortify their village. The division grew violent, culminating in bloodshed. When the dust settled, both factions realized the vision had been symbolic, representing the city that existed within them. An image meant to guide introspection, not migration or conflict. The scribe concludes that Revelation speaks in symbols because symbols bypass the limitations of language, but symbols are also inherently open to misinterpretation. He laments that humanity often confuses the map with the destination, the metaphor with the meaning. Another text explores this tension through the story of a man who believed he was chosen to interpret the signs of the cycle. He devoted years to studying ancient symbols, star alignments, and dream messages. Eventually, he became convinced that he alone possessed the clarity to guide his people through the coming convergence. But the manuscript reveals that his confidence was misplaced. The visions he attributed to Revelation were distorted echoes produced by his own longing for significance. When the convergence finally arrived, his predictions proved disastrously wrong. The community, having trusted his interpretations, found itself unprepared for the actual upheaval. The writer, witnessing this tragedy, implores future generations to distinguish humility from certainty. He insists that revelation is not a prize bestowed upon the ambitious, but a responsibility entrusted to the humble. Yet the forbidden texts do not portray humanity as helpless. They describe a profound potential lying dormant within the human mind, an ability to perceive patterns, derive meaning from chaos, and connect with realms beyond physical reality. One manuscript calls this potential the inner lantern, claiming that each person carries a flickering light capable of illuminating the deeper layers of existence. The writer insists that revelation does not introduce new knowledge. It awakens what is already known but forgotten. He describes experiences in which simple objects, a stone, a leaf, a pool of water, suddenly revealed correspondences between the natural world and the unseen realm. He claims that everything in the world carries a signature, a unique resonance that can be perceived by the inner lantern during periods when the veil thins. This idea suggests that revelation is less about receiving information and more about perceiving the inherent meaning woven into reality. This perspective contrasts sharply with manuscripts that emphasize external encounters with radiant beings. Yet the texts are not contradictory. They reveal two aspects of the same phenomenon. The watchers, according to some scribes, communicate externally only when the inner lantern grows too dim to perceive their influence. When individuals or civilizations nurture this inner clarity, revelation unfolds from within, requiring no external visitation. This duality complicates any attempt to categorize the watchers as purely physical or metaphysical beings. The texts portray them as entities capable of crossing the boundary between realms, yet also as symbols activated by the human psyche during periods of heightened awareness. Whether they exist independently or emerge from the human collective unconscious remains deliberately ambiguous. One manuscript attempts to reconcile this ambiguity by proposing a model of layered reality. The writer claims that existence consists of multiple interwoven dimensions, each influencing the others. The watchers, he argues, inhabit an adjacent dimension, close enough to observe and intervene, but separated by laws that prevent constant interaction. Human consciousness, he suggests, occasionally overlaps with this dimension during altered states induced by dreams, rituals, or cycles of revelation. The manuscript describes a diagram composed of concentric circles representing the layers of reality, with arrows indicating points of intersection. Though the diagram itself is lost, The accompanying text suggests that the Watchers can communicate only through these intersection points. This model aligns with modern theories about parallel realities or quantum entanglement, though expressed in a language grounded in ancient cosmology. Another manuscript expands this model into a narrative. The scribe describes a time when the layers of reality aligned perfectly, allowing humanity to perceive the Watchers openly. He claims this alignment lasted several generations, during which knowledge flowed freely between realms. Humans learned to manipulate energies now forgotten, to travel across landscapes using pathways that no longer exist, and to build structures designed to stabilize the alignment. But the alignment eventually shifted, closing the pathways and plunging humanity into an era of confusion. The scribe laments that much of the knowledge was lost, not because it was hidden, but because the world itself changed, making the old techniques ineffective. He compares the alignment to a season, suggesting that revelation, too, is seasonal, governed by cycles beyond human control. As the manuscripts delve deeper into these models, another theme emerges: the role of emotion in shaping revelation. Several texts claim that human emotion resonates within the veil, influencing how revelation manifests. One scribe insists that fear thickens the veil, preventing revelation from penetrating fully. Another claims that compassion thins the veil, allowing insights to flow more freely. These writings describe ancient rituals designed not to summon revelation, but to cultivate emotional clarity, preparing individuals or communities to receive whatever the cycle brings. The scribes warn that emotions such as envy, anger, or despair can distort revelation, turning symbols into nightmares and visions into illusions. This suggests a worldview in which revelation is not imposed upon humanity, but co-created with it, a dynamic interplay between cosmic forces and human consciousness. The manuscripts also explore the physical consequences of revelation. One text describes a region where the veil thinned so intensely that the land itself changed. Water flowed uphill, trees twisted into impossible shapes, and shadows detached from their objects. The inhabitants initially interpreted these phenomena as miracles, but soon realized they were signs of instability. The writer claims that the Watchers intervened, restoring balance through a series of subtle adjustments that manifested as changes in weather patterns and seismic activity. Though the narrative is fantastical, it reflects the broader theme that revelation has tangible effects on the natural world. It suggests that the cycles influence not only human consciousness, but the physical structure of the world, shaping landscapes and altering ecosystems. Another manuscript describes the opposite effect: a region where the veil thickened, creating a zone of spiritual obscurity. The writer claims that people who entered the region felt disoriented, unable to dream or meditate. The animals behaved strangely, avoiding the area as if sensing a disturbance. The text suggests that the Watchers withdrew from the region, leaving it barren of revelation. Whether literal or metaphorical, the story emphasizes the variability of revelation's presence across different locations. Some regions act as gateways, others as blind spots. This uneven distribution raises questions about the purpose behind the cycles. Are certain regions meant to serve as sanctuaries, while others serve as testing grounds? Or are these variations simply byproducts of the world's complex energetic structure? As the manuscripts approach their final pages, they become increasingly concerned with what they call the Great Confluence, a period when multiple cycles intersect. The scribes believed that such a confluence occurred only once every several ages, bringing intense upheaval and profound transformation. They describe it as a moment when both the inner lantern and the external revelations ignite simultaneously, overwhelming the vessel of humanity unless it has expanded sufficiently to contain the influx. One scribe writes that during the Great Confluence, the Watchers walk the world in forms barely distinguishable from humans, appearing in dreams, visions, and even in waking life. He claims that these forms are projections, not physical embodiments, designed to minimize disruption to the fabric of reality. Yet he warns that the Watchers are not alone. Other forces, darker and more chaotic, also take advantage of the confluence to press into the world. This raises the question of what the manuscripts mean by darker forces. They rarely describe these entities directly, perhaps out of fear or reverence. One text refers to them as those without form, suggesting that they exist outside the structure of the cycles. Another describes them as remnants of previous epochs, entities shaped by failed revelations, trapped between realms. These fragments suggest that the cycles produce not only evolution, but residue, echoes of past civilizations that did not integrate revelation successfully. The scribes warn that these echoes can influence the living, especially during periods of convergence or confluence. They describe visions of voices calling from the depths of the veil, urging individuals to abandon their paths or distort their interpretations. These warnings imply that revelation is not a neutral force, but a battleground between clarity and confusion, between integration and fragmentation. One of the most haunting manuscripts describes a vision of a great storm sweeping across the world during a future confluence. The writer claims he saw cities crumbling, oceans rising, and the Watchers standing motionless as the storm passed over them. He understood the scene not as a literal prediction, but as a symbol of the overwhelming nature of revelation when it arrives unchecked. The storm represented the collapse of old frameworks, the dissolution of outdated beliefs, and the eruption of truths too powerful to ignore. The writer insists that the storm is not a punishment, but a purification, clearing the path for a new cycle. Yet he fears that humanity may resist the storm, clinging to structures that no longer serve its growth. He concludes with a plea. Prepare the vessel, for the storm cares nothing for what you build upon the sand. Another manuscript ends on a more hopeful note. The writer describes a vision of humanity standing at the threshold of a new age, illuminated by a radiant dawn. He claims that in this vision, the veil becomes transparent, allowing humans to perceive the Watchers without fear. The boundaries between realms soften, enabling knowledge to flow freely for the first time in millennia. The writer believes this vision represents the culmination of all cycles, a moment when revelation becomes permanent rather than periodic. He calls this moment the seamless light, a state in which the vessel of humanity no longer cracks under the weight of truth, but expands to contain it effortlessly. Though poetic, the vision suggests that the cycles are leading somewhere, that the iterations of revelation, collapse, and renewal are shaping humanity for a final transformation. Yet even in this hopeful text, uncertainty remains. The writer admits he does not know when or how the seamless light will arrive. He warns that the path toward it is fraught with danger. requiring humanity to confront the illusions that have sustained it for centuries. He insists that the greatest barrier to revelation is not ignorance, but fear, the fear of losing identity, control, or meaning. This fear, he claims, is what thickens the veil and distorts the symbols. To reach the seamless light, humanity must learn to accept the dissolution of its old narratives, to release the stories that once provided comfort but now hinder growth. By the end of the forbidden manuscripts, a profound paradox emerges. Revelation is both the greatest gift and the greatest threat. It has guided humanity through epochs, shaped civilizations, and expanded consciousness. Yet it has also shattered societies, overwhelmed individuals, and triggered catastrophes when misinterpreted. The Watchers appear not as saviors or tyrants, but as custodians of a delicate balance, seeking to nurture humanity's growth while respecting its autonomy. Their presence is constant but subtle, woven into dreams, symbols, and cycles that unfold across millennia. The manuscripts offer no final conclusion, only a gesture toward the horizon, a recognition that revelation is still unfolding, that the cycles continue, and that humanity stands on the threshold of another turning. They imply that the great confluence is not a distant myth, but an approaching reality, one that will test the vessel of humanity more profoundly than any previous cycle. Whether humanity rises to meet it or collapses under its weight remains the central question woven through every fragmented page. The ancient scribes could not answer this question. They could only record what they saw, what they sensed, what they feared and hoped. And in their words, preserved across centuries despite every attempt to silence them, humanity finds both a warning and an invitation, a call to prepare for the revelation that is yet to come. In the final layers of the forbidden manuscripts, the tone becomes strangely calm, as though the scribes, after pages filled with warnings, revelations, and visions of cycles colliding, have reached a quiet resignation. Not despair, but acceptance. The writings seem to recognize that the patterns they have traced across millennia cannot be stopped, resisted, or even fully understood. They can only be witnessed. If earlier texts are filled with urgency, anticipation, and fear, these last fragments read like whispers from those who have finally learned to listen without demanding answers. They speak from a vantage point beyond panic or awe, as though revelation, once terrifying, has begun to appear inevitable. Part of a vast rhythm that humanity does not need to control, only to meet with open eyes. One of the final manuscripts begins with an image so gentle it contrasts sharply with everything that came before. The writer describes watching dawn spread across a valley, illuminating ancient stones half buried in grass. He writes that in that moment he understood revelation not as lightning striking the earth, but as dawn rising, quietly, persistently, dissolving darkness without force. He suggests that the great upheavals described in earlier cycles were not punishment or judgment, but humanity's own reactions to truths it was unprepared to receive. Revelation does not break us, he writes. We break against it. This simple insight marks a radical shift in perspective. It reframes the entire narrative. Revelation is constant, patient, waiting. It is humanity's capacity, not the revelation itself, that determines whether the experience becomes enlightenment or catastrophe. Another fragment continues this thought by describing revelation as water flowing downhill. The scribe claims that throughout history, humanity has built barriers, belief systems, hierarchies, structures of power that attempted to divert or contain this flow. But revelation, like water, finds a way through. Sometimes it trickles, sometimes it floods. The writer argues that the cycles are not imposed from above, but emerge naturally from the tension between revelation's persistence and humanity's attempts to evade or harness it. When the tension grows too great, the flood arrives. This interpretation transforms the cycles from cosmic interventions into natural consequences, events arising from imbalance, like earthquakes releasing pressure built over centuries. Several manuscripts emphasize this theme of imbalance. They claim that the Watchers observed these tensions long before humanity recognized them, adjusting their interventions accordingly. Some texts portray the Watchers not as initiators of revelation, but as regulators, helping humanity maintain equilibrium so that revelation can integrate gradually. But the writers also admit that the Watchers cannot always prevent upheaval. They are described as guardians of the cycle, not its creators. And in the final manuscripts, even the Watchers appear vulnerable, subject to forces that surpass their comprehension, just as revelation surpasses human understanding. One scribe recounts a vision in which he saw a radiant figure sitting beside a vast pool. In the pool, reflections of countless worlds shimmered, each representing a different stage of the cycle. As he watched, the radiant figure touched the surface of the pool, sending ripples across the reflections. Some worlds brightened, others dimmed. The scribe sensed that the figure was not controlling the worlds, but responding to them, adjusting their trajectories with delicate, uncertain gestures. The vision ended with the realization that the Watchers themselves exist within a larger revelation, subject to cycles far beyond the ones they oversee. This insight humbles the narrative. It suggests that revelation is not a hierarchy descending from higher to lower beings, but an endless cascade of discovery radiating through all realms of existence. A different manuscript takes this idea further by suggesting that humanity plays a more significant role in the cosmic cycle than previously believed. The writer claims that the Watchers observe humanity not because humans are weak, but because they are unique, possessing a form of consciousness capable of bridging multiple realms. He describes humanity as the pivot of the veil, capable of influencing the permeability between dimensions simply by the quality of its collective awareness. This idea reframes humanity as an active participant in the cosmic dance, not merely a spectator. The writer suggests that the convergence and the great confluence described in earlier texts are not events happening to humanity, but events happening through humanity, manifestations of shifts within the human collective mind that ripple outward into the unseen world. Another manuscript reinforces this view by describing a ritual practiced by an ancient mountain civilization. The ritual involved hundreds of people gathering at a stone platform carved with symbols representing cycles of revelation. The participants would breathe in unison, generating a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the earth. According to the scribe, this ritual stabilized the veil during periods of upheaval, preventing distortions and false revelations from intruding. The writer claims that when the community performed the ritual with fear, the harmony faltered and the veil thickened. When they performed it with serenity, the veil thinned, allowing the Watchers to communicate more clearly. This suggests that human emotion and collective intention can shape the flow of revelation itself. The ritual was not a plea to the watchers, but a collaboration with them, a way of synchronizing human and cosmic rhythms. Yet not all manuscripts express such hope. Some warn that humanity's growing disconnection from these ancient practices may lead to a future where revelation arrives unchecked, overwhelming the vessel entirely. A scribe from a coastal civilization describes dreams of a veil tearing from horizon to horizon, revealing a sky filled with forms too immense to comprehend. He insists that the dream was not metaphorical, but a preview of what would occur if humanity continued to ignore the cycles. He writes that revelation, when rejected for too long, becomes a shockwave rather than a dawn. The manuscript ends abruptly, as if the writer could not bring himself to describe the full extent of the vision. Another text presents a contrasting vision, one of profound beauty. The scribe describes an age when the cycles finally align, bringing clarity to the entire world simultaneously. He claims that during this age, individuals across different continents will experience shared dreams, shared intuitions, shared awakenings. He envisions humanity rediscovering the ancient symbols, not through excavation or scholarship, but through spontaneous remembrance. He writes that the watchers will no longer need to appear in radiant forms because humanity will finally perceive them directly across the thin veil that separates their realms. This age, he claims, will mark the transformation of revelation from an event into a state, a permanent transparency of consciousness. The text acknowledges, however, that this vision represents a potential future, not a guaranteed one. The scribe insists that humanity must choose alignment over fear, clarity over distortion, humility over domination. He warns that the final cycle is approaching, but its outcome depends on how humanity responds to the rising tide of revelation already seeping through the cracks of the modern world. He writes that signs of the cycle are everywhere. Dreams shared among strangers, ancient sites humming with new energy, scientific discoveries revealing patterns long known to the scribes of forgotten epochs. In a particularly striking manuscript, the writer describes modern humanity without ever having seen it. He claims that a future civilization will live surrounded by symbols they do not understand, technologies that mimic ancient devices, yet operate without awareness of the cycles governing them. He writes that this civilization will experience a resurgence of dreams, visions, and intuitive insights. Some individuals will dismiss these as illusions. Others will embrace them too eagerly, falling into the traps of false revelation. The scribe warns that the watchers will attempt to guide this future age gently, but their influence will be subtle, easily missed. The text seems to describe our world with eerie accuracy. Its confusion, its longing, its fragmentation, its search for meaning amid unprecedented change. The manuscript concludes with an image of a great mirror suspended in darkness. The writer claims that revelation is this mirror, absolute, impartial, reflecting whatever stands before it. For some, it reflects brilliance, for others, shadows. The mirror does not judge, it reveals. The scribe warns that humanity must prepare to face this mirror, not with fear, but with honesty. He insists that the greatest danger is self-deception, the belief that revelation confirms one's expectations rather than revealing deeper truths that challenge them. He writes, "The mirror does not lie, but it also does not speak unless the seeker is ready to listen. Other manuscripts echo this motif, describing revelation as a dissolution of illusions. One writer claims that when the final cycle arrives, humanity will experience a collective remembering, a sudden recognition of patterns that were always present but ignored. This remembering will not be comfortable. It will strip away narratives that once provided identity and purpose. But he insists that beneath the fear lies liberation. He compares the process to waking from a long dream, realizing that the dream was meaningful but not absolute. Revelation, he writes, is not the creation of new truth, but the recognition of truth that was always present. Another text expands on this by describing a practice known as the unbinding. The practitioner would sit in silence, contemplating symbols carved into stone tablets. The goal was not to interpret the symbols intellectually, but to allow them to dismantle the practitioner's assumptions. The writer claims that the unbinding dissolved the layers of belief accumulated over a lifetime, exposing the raw awareness beneath. He describes the experience as terrifying but transformative. Through the unbinding, the practitioner aligned with the cycles, becoming a vessel capable of receiving revelation without distortion. The scribe suggests that if humanity as a whole could undergo a similar unbinding, the transition into the final cycle would unfold peacefully rather than catastrophically. The manuscripts also contain accounts of individuals who achieved extraordinary clarity during earlier cycles. One describes a hermit who lived beside a desert canyon, spending years listening to the wind. The scribe claims that the hermit eventually perceived patterns within the wind's sound, messages encoded in the ebbs and flows of air. According to the text, the hermit learned to predict storms, migrations, even political upheavals based on subtle changes in the atmosphere. The scribe insists that the hermit's abilities were not magical, but a result of deep attunement. He suggests that similar abilities lie dormant within all humans, waiting to be awakened during periods of thinning veil. The hermit serves as a symbol of what humanity could become if it learned to listen again. Another manuscript tells of a community that lived in harmony with revelation for generations. The writer describes them as farmers and craftspeople who read the cycles as easily as reading the seasons. They cultivated not only crops, but wisdom, passing down practices that fostered clarity and compassion. The scribe claims that during a major convergence, this community experienced no upheaval. Instead, they welcomed the revelation with serenity, integrating its insights effortlessly. Their civilization flourished for centuries, leaving behind artifacts that radiated a quiet, enduring beauty. The manuscript portrays them as an example of what is possible when humanity lives in alignment with the cycles rather than in resistance to them. As the final manuscripts near their end, the tone shifts once more, becoming reflective, almost intimate. The scribes no longer speak as historians or prophets, but as individuals aware of their place in a vast unfolding. They recognize that their writings may be misunderstood, ignored, or lost. Yet they write anyway, compelled by a sense of duty to the future. Several texts end with personal confessions, scribes admitting their own fears, doubts, and limitations. They acknowledge that they did not always interpret revelation clearly, that their words may reflect their own biases. But they also express hope that future generations, armed with new insights and broader perspectives, will decode what they could not. In one fragment, a scribe writes that revelation is like the night sky. impossible to grasp fully, yet mesmerizing in its depth. He claims that each star represents a truth and each constellation a story. But the sky is not static. It shifts with time, revealing new patterns to those who learn to look. The scribe concludes that humanity must learn to become like the sky, vast, flexible, open to change. Only then can it withstand the light of revelation without breaking. Another manuscript ends with a single line, written so faintly that only modern imaging has revealed it. Prepare not for the revelation, but for the self that will meet it. This line encapsulates the essence of the forbidden texts. The scribes understood that revelation is inevitable, that cycles turned regardless of human desire. The true preparation lies within, cultivating clarity, humility, resilience, and openness. And so the forbidden manuscripts close, not with prophecy, not with warning, not with certainty, but with possibility. They leave behind a tapestry of visions, symbols, and reflections that challenge humanity to expand its understanding of itself and the world. They suggest that revelation is not an ending, but a threshold, inviting humanity into a deeper relationship with reality. Whether the approaching cycle brings dawn or storm depends not on the watchers, not on cosmic forces, but on the vessel of humanity itself, its willingness to grow, to listen, to let go. And somewhere within these final lines, beneath the trembling script and fading ink, a quiet message lingers. Revelation is already here. It is waiting for you to notice.